Or good afternoon now. I'm Rob Atkinson. I'm president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. For those of you who don't know, we're a 501c3 think tank in Washington that focuses on innovation policy and how we can get more innovation by having the right policies. So we're really pleased to have this event on sort of the topic du jour of technology and jobs, which we're going to talk about this morning and this afternoon, and more importantly, what do we need to do about it? What can we do about it? And particularly, what are the things Congress can do about it? So before I introduce our four excellent panelists, we're honored to have two members of Congress with us, Congressman Holtgren, who will join us a little bit later, and then right now, Congressman John Delaney. Congressman Delaney was elected in 2012 to serve Maryland's 6th District. He was named in 2017 one of the world's 50 of the world's greatest leaders by Fortune magazine, the only member of Congress to make that list, only member of the House. He spent a business career starting and running successful companies. He is the chairman and founder of the Artificial Intelligence Caucus, which is directly on target with a lot of the challenges we're going to face. And he also serves on the Joint Economic Committee and the Financial Services Committee. So, Congressman Delaney, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, everyone. Good afternoon, by 2 minutes here. So, it's great to speak to you about a topic that I do care deeply about, which is thinking about the effects of technology and thinking about the effects of change in general on our economy, on our nation, and on its workforce. And I come at this from the perspective of someone who's fundamentally an optimist about not only the country and the world, but what innovation and change does for our nation. And I think the facts really do favor the optimist. If you look back across time at what technological innovation and global interconnection, two things that were to some extent demonized in the last presidential election, really by both sides, I think have clearly been positive for the state of the world, state of the country, and the state of humankind. I mean, I look back, I was born a little over 50 years ago, and when I was born, about 25% of the world was connected, right? 75% of the world lived in kind of local communities, villages, where they had no connection to the broader economy or the broader global economy. And yet at that time, the poverty rate, the global poverty rate, as measured by the percentage of countries where a majority of their population lives in poverty, was about 60 or 70%. So you had a situation where most of the world wasn't connected and most of the world was in poverty. If you fast forward 50 years, the numbers have become inverted. About 75% of the world is interconnected economically, and the global poverty rate is down to about 25%. And there's lots of theories as to why that has happened, but it's clear it has happened because the world has become connected, and what has allowed the world to become connected is technological innovation. And so, despite the fact that globalization and technology have in fact negatively affected many communities in this country, because change has occurred very rapidly, we weren't ready for it, we didn't do the right things, it has, by and large, been an extraordinarily positive thing. And I expect that to continue. Across time, as you know, people have talked about what innovation will do to work. This is not a new concern. This concern goes back across really the world's histories. The Luddites came from this. President Kennedy talked extensively about this when he was the president. And the reason this fear is kind of a recurring theme is because whenever you have a lot of change, it's fairly obvious who will be negatively affected by the change, but it's not at all obvious what the positive benefits will be. So you tend to look at change really through one lens and not two, because the one lens is very clear and the other lens is really not particularly clear because your mind really can't think about how this innovation will really change work in the world in ways that none of us can imagine. And so across time, people who have said that these changes would be negative, they've always been proven wrong in the fullness of time. And I suspect if we were having this conversation 30, 40 years ago, mostly about globalization, it would be fairly obvious who would be negatively affected by it. And those are, in fact, the people who were negatively affected by it. And we probably wouldn't do a very good job of understanding the positives. But that failure that occurred with that generation of leaders was really not to do enough to respond to the people who were negatively affected by it. And I don't want that mistake to happen again, because I think the change that's occurring in the world is fundamentally very positive. It'll improve the life of our citizens. It'll improve the condition of the world. It'll improve the life of humankind. But there will be some people negatively affected by it. And I think we have a pretty good sense as to who they're going to be. And we should be doing something about it, which is one of the reasons I'm interested in this issue. One of the reasons I founded the Artificial Intelligence Caucus, not because I think artificial intelligence is negative. I actually think it's positive. But the more robust a conversation we have about it here on the Hill, the more we confront its negatives and its positives and put in place policy to ensure that transition as smooth as possible, I think is a fundamentally good public policy. And that's really what I'm trying to do. Because I think the way the world will unfold is pretty obvious. And what we need to do as a country is also pretty obvious. We need to make our country more innovative, more competitive, more entrepreneurial, encourage more startups, and fundamentally invest more in basic research, because a lot of the big challenges we have, climate change, things like that, we really do have to invent our way out of them. And so a nation that's robust in its competitiveness and its entrepreneurial spirit, has lots of startups, and is making disproportionate investment in basic research against some of the big problems in the world, is clearly part of our future if we want to succeed. But the other part of our future is to make sure that our citizens are actually prepared to be engaged in that kind of a society and that kind of a workforce, both, if you will, when they get started with their lives through their basic educational system, which will need to change. The K through 12 system, which largely emerged after the Industrial Revolution in its modern form, needs to be, that educational pathway needs to be changed, in my opinion, from pre-K through something post-high school, probably not four-year college, but something post-high school. And every citizen ought to get that. But we're also going to make sure, because it's likely that workers are going to be changing jobs very frequently, they're going to increasingly need new skills, that we have to really reimagine the social contract so that people feel more secure both in their lives and their ability to get the skills they need to get a job. And that's really the problem we have in the world right now. A very large percentage of the population isn't secure. They're not moving. They're not getting married. They're kind of disengaging from society because they're afraid. And we haven't done enough to make them secure. So that's how I think about policy in this area, which is make the country more entrepreneurial and redo the social contract so that people can actually succeed in the world that we know is coming. And I think it's consistent with the work you do.
Great, thank you so much.
So that's all I'll have to say, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Okay. Maybe time for one question if anyone has one, or back here.
Okay.
Okay.
Great. Nice to see you all.
All right. So I see a seat there, a seat here. There's a seat here. If people want to just grab one, there's a couple back here. First of all, I apologize that we don't have more room, and I apologize that it doesn't look like there's any food, but there are some cookies, so have that. So I want to start by introducing our panel, and I'm saying this is like theater in the round, so we'll turn around and do our thing. On my immediate left is Adam Thayer. Adam is a longtime colleague. He's a senior research fellow with the Technology Policy Program at the Mercatus Center at George Mason. Adam is a prolific scholar in a wide variety of areas around technology, the internet, media, and digital privacy. He's also authored or edited 8 books, and his latest book, which is I would encourage you all to read, is a book, Permissionless Innovation, The Continuing Case for Comprehensive Technological Freedom. Robert Friedel is a professor in the Department of History at the University of Maryland, where he's taught the history of technology and science for more than 30 years. Before coming to College Park, he was a historian at the Smithsonian Institution, and he was also the first director of the IEEE Center for the History of Electrical Engineering. I don't remember how I was alerted to Robert's book, but I was, and I was so glad of it, which is why we made the connection here. But if you haven't read his book, A Culture of Improvement, Technology and the Western Millennium, It's a wonderful book, especially if you like history and you like technology, which I like both. But it's a great book, and Robert can talk a little bit about some of his thoughts and findings there. Lauren Easter is a senior research associate in the Incomes and Benefits Policy Center at the Urban Institute, where her research focuses on innovative workforce development programs and how to best evaluate and learn from them. Most recently, Esther has looked at industry-focused job training and career pathway initiatives through workforce investment systems and community colleges. Finally, my colleague Ted Alden is the Bernard L. Schwartz Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Ted specializes in U.S. economic competitiveness, including a wide variety of areas there, including worker retraining programs and education. Again, if you haven't read his new book, I would encourage you to do that. It's a really focused book, but an easy read, I guess would be the way I would put it. It's very clearly written. It's called Failure to Adjust: How Americans Got Left Behind in the Global Economy. All right, so let me just start off by, there we go. So if you're on the side, you can look at that, and you have a great view. So, all right, so there has been this growing concern, not just in the United States, but really around the world, that we're somehow poised to enter this really unprecedented technological revolution, and it's going to have major negative impacts on the labor force. Let me suggest that neither of those are really right, and especially the last point is not right. So that's ITIF, you know about us. So we want to do four quick things today. What are the claims people are making about technology and work? How do we think about that historically, which is important to understand? Is the future going to be different? And then what should policymakers do? So there's this cottage industry of TED Talks and other speeches and books that say this is some major thing, the singularity, the second machine age, the third wave, the fourth wave, the fifth. Everybody's kind of getting, now we're at infinite progress. Everybody's trying to one-up each other on making these claims that somehow this is just this, this is bigger than the Industrial Revolution. Robert has studied the Industrial Revolution and can tell you how big that was. This is not bigger than that. And these claims are based upon these sort of overarching claims are based upon a few little pieces of, quote, evidence. One is that we're supposedly entering the second half of this exponential chessboard with regard to Moore's Law. The chips in here are doubling every 18 months, and oh my God, what's going to happen next? Unfortunate reality is Moore's Law is slowing down. It's growing at half the rate it grew 10 years ago. And for the first time since Moore's Law was Moore's Law, we've seen an increase in what's called MIPS, millions instructions per second. We've seen an increase in cost per MIPS. So Moore's Law is not going to continue the way it is. It'll at some point peak out, and then maybe some other technology will emerge, but that's a long way off in our view. And it leads people to have this sort of strange notion that we're in a period of exponential change. And one, if you really think about that, the pace of change is growing exponentially. That means that if we had 2 inventions today, we're going to have 4 tomorrow, and we're going to have 8 the next year. That just simply is ludicrous when you think about it. If you look at the rate of any kind of innovation measures in the U.S., they're arithmetic. They're not exponential. Patent growth is arithmetic. It's not exponential. New companies, not exponential. But if you buy into this whole narrative, then technological change, unprecedented change, we're going to have massive technological job loss. So good example is Martin Ford's book, The Rise of the Robots, and the threat of, quote, a jobless future. That means, by the way, a jobless future. Most of us will not have jobs in this world that they're envisioning. And you can see some of the claims there. Even respected sources like The Economist have bought into this. But what I love is that everybody keeps upping the number. The Osborne and Frey, the Oxford study said 47% of jobs, but then it's 75%. And now the latest entry into that, but by the way, folks, if you want to, I don't know if there's seats over there, if you want to thread out, feel free. The latest entry of that is a Silicon Valley gadfly, Vivek Wadhwa, who says that 80 to 90% of our jobs will be eliminated in 10 to 15 years. So that means look around, look to your right, look to your left, all of you will be eliminated. So let's think about that first a minute from a historical perspective. So we did that. We looked at a data set run by the Minnesota Population Center, which looked at Bureau of Labor Statistics occupational data from 1850 to 2015. So you don't need to worry about all those details unless you want to, or you can read the book. But essentially what we did is we looked at each decade and said, in the decade, how much occupational churn was going on. In other words, was there an occupation that lost a lot of jobs, or an occupation that gained a lot of jobs, and then you add up the absolute value of those, and you get this sort of measure of how much churn there was in each decade. Again, I won't go through that. Here's some examples of how technology has changed employment. So there were no locomotive engineers in 1840 in the US because we didn't have any locomotives. We invented locomotives, and all of a sudden, if you add those three occupations up, this was the rate of change. It was growing really through the 1880s, actually to 1910 a little bit. Then it started to go down. So why did it start to go down? Well, we also, in 1900 or so, we invented another thing called the long-haul truck, and that started to take away freight. We also made trains more efficient, so you didn't need 4 or 5 people on a train to run it. You could do it with 3 or even 2. So technology's always changed occupations. Here's another one. We forget about sort of how occupations grow because of technology. And we didn't have any mechanics, auto mechanics in 1900 because we had no autos, or very few. They were just owned by hobbyists. And then you saw auto mechanic jobs grow dramatically as cars grew dramatically. But then if you look at 2000, what happened? I don't know what happened. What I'm speculating on, I used to actually fix cars as a spare time with me, and if you're old enough to remember, cars used to have points, and you'd have to go in there and gap the points and replace the points. This has made the spark plugs work. They don't have, it's all electronic ignition. Cars are so much better than they are. So partly what this explanation is, car technology just got so much better, lasts longer, doesn't need as many repairs. So the number of mechanics went down. Motion picture projectionists. We didn't, again, have any motion picture projectionists in 1900 because Edison hadn't invented the motion picture. But we did, and it started growing. But then it peaked in 1940. What happened between 1940 and 1950? Television. People started going, instead of going to the movies every 2 or 3 nights a week, they stayed home. But then you also look at what happened there is in 2015, what's that all about? That's not about people not going to the movies. That's about essentially theaters that have multi-screens on them. In the old days, you had 1 projectionist for 1 movie theater. Now you have 1 projectionist for 6 screens, essentially. So again, technology has changed these occupations. But it's also created growth. This is an example of computer occupations. Computer occupations grew dramatically once we started using mainframes, then microcomputers, laptops, internet, et cetera. So when you look at all that, look at that all together, all of these jobs that grew in occupations, all that declined, and you say, what was the rate of occupational change? Well, you go back to the last half of the 1800s, and there was massive occupational shifts. There were whole occupations that were destroyed within 20 years. And then all these new occupations created. So if you look at 2000 to 2010, which is sort of the last full decade pair that we have, what you see there is that it's the lowest rate of occupational churn in American history since 1850, the lowest. You know, if you talk to most of the people in this field, they will tell you, no, what we're living in now is an unprecedented rate of occupational change. Whole occupations being destroyed. I mean, we can think of a couple, travel agents and reporters, okay? Reporters were, lots fewer reporters today because of the rise of the internet, lots fewer travel agents. But that's the things people put in their mind. But if you look at the overall picture, it's a lot better. This is using a little bit different methodology. Again, the same thing, very, very low occupational change. And then this is the most recent methodology, again, going from 1950 to 2015, you know, really low rates of change. So if you want to say, well, maybe that's just because some occupations grew, if you just look at absolute losses, just add up all of the losses, so occupations that had an absolute loss. The reason there weren't that many back then, by the way, is the population of the U.S. was growing so dramatically because of immigration. Labor forces were growing dramatically. So there weren't a lot that had absolute losses. Again, you can see in the last 100 years, 2000 to 2010, pretty low levels of absolute loss. Now, another way to look at that, you go back to 1960, 1970, big losses. I'll give you a couple of good examples there. Telephone operators. There used to be a lot of telephone operators in this country, and they got eliminated. There used to actually be a big whole set of occupations called file clerk. Believe it or not, people who did something with paper files and put them somewhere and took them out. Those occupations were destroyed, and we forget about that. The other reason we're seeing less of this is most of the occupational churn in the US was with farms, and it was just farmers not being able to be farmers anymore. Now, you can argue we didn't handle that transition very well, but the rate of this is much, much lower today. Now, one last thing before I move on. One of the things we looked at is, and this was a little bit of a qualitative assessment, but we looked at every occupation in every decade to say, did we think the change was due to technology? So, for example, when auto repairs, when movie projectionists came about, that was clearly because of technology. But then you look at some other occupation that declined, because people were, good example was people were buying less personal services, and that went down. So then if you just look at how much did technology create jobs versus how much did it destroy jobs, there is no decade from 1950 to the present where technology created more jobs than it destroyed. And it's a really important point. And why don't we have mass unemployment? Because most of the jobs created from technology are from just us all having a little bit more money because productivity went up, and so we buy a couch, or we go on vacation, or we send our kid to college, and so now we have more furniture makers, we have more college professors, et cetera, et cetera. But what's interesting there is that in the 2000 to 2015 range, technology actually did pretty well. It created more new jobs than we would think. So, I'm going to skip that. So, how do we think about that? Historically, as Congressman Delaney alluded to, there have been these fears over time where people have said, this is really, really going to be bad. I love these quotes from the 70s and 80s. Nils Nilsson is one of the leading AI scientists in 1984, like the leading AI scientist. And he basically said, oh, this is happening so quickly we should give up on full employment. Marvin Minsky, again, the leading AI scientist at MIT in the 70s. That prediction didn't quite work out. 3 to 8 years, general AI, nor will it work out in the next 8 years. This, by the way, is a robot from a great episode of The Twilight Zone, if you've ever seen that one, where the manager comes in, has all the robots eliminate all the workers, and then the last scene is the robot comes in and eliminates the manager. That's in our brain right now. So, is the future going to be different? It's fine for me to say all this, and then the other side will say, well, yeah, but you don't really understand what's going on, and the future is going to be different. I don't think the future will be different. I love this quote by Rodney Brooks that we had in a piece we did on AI. Rodney Brooks is one of the leading roboticists and AI scholars, experts in the country at MIT. And basically his point here is just because we went from use an example, we went from the horse and buggy to the internal combustion engine, doesn't mean that warp drive is around the corner. In other words, just because we're making things a little bit better doesn't mean that artificial general intelligence is around the corner. What people mean by artificial general intelligence is a machine that is basically as capable as a human and therefore could do every job we can do. That's as long away, in my view, as warp drive is. It's not going to happen for all our lifetimes. So another way to think about this technologically, I think, is everybody's panicked that, oh, we're going to have autonomous trucks, we're going to get rid of all the truckers, we're going to have all this other, bang, it's going to be binary, 0 to 100. This is the elevator operators in the US. There were very few early on because they didn't have elevators till we built steel skyscrapers, and then we needed a way to get up and down them. But what's interesting is Otis Elevator invented the automatic elevator, the push-button self-service elevator in 1923. Elevator operators keep growing and growing and growing. And then finally, enough elevator operators become self-service that they go away. Now, technically, that number in 1990 should have had 3. because the last bastion of elevator operators was the House of Representatives. And that was, to me, the most important thing Speaker Gingrich did when he took over in '94 was to get rid of the House elevator operators. So they were the leading edge, if you will, of innovation there. So if you haven't seen the Osborne and Frey study, I guarantee you, just go and Google technology job loss. I guarantee within the first 5 results, you will see the Osborne and Frey study. These are 2 professors at Oxford. Did this study, non-peer reviewed, I would add, that said all of these occupations are going to be eliminated by technology in 20 years. To be very clear, their methodology was not, let's look at each occupation. It was using what's called ONET, which is part of the BLS. And it just said if an occupation has these characteristics, like it's sort of routine and it's sort of using this kind of level of cognition, it will be eliminated. These are the occupations they said are going to be eliminated in 20 years. School bus drivers. So I don't know how many of you have kids, but they can invent an automated school bus, but they will never not have an adult on it. Because it would be Lord of the Flies, I guarantee you, every single day. So there will still be somebody on the bus. They may not be driving it, but they're going to be on the bus. Fashion models. Really? So you make a $4,000 dress, you're going to put it on a robot? Versace robot dress? I don't think so. And the last one was haircuts. By the way, this was a vision from 1890 on what they thought the year 2000 would look like, that we'd have robotic, mechanized haircuts. So that's only on the Jetsons where you get your haircut like that. We're still going to get our haircut by actual people with scissors or whatever. The reality is most jobs are super hard to automate. I just went through this, and if you look at the BLS occupation, I just started with like 57, then I went to 157. I just randomly, you got to trust me, randomly picked occupations. Most of those are super hard to automate. I don't see a robot cleaning your teeth when you go to the dentist. I don't see a robot fighting fires. I certainly don't see a robot educating our preschool kids. It's just really, really hard to do a lot of these things. The McKinsey Institute, Global Institute, had a study that said that, which is widely cited, 42% of jobs, it's cited as 42% of jobs will be eliminated by automation. No, what McKinsey said was 5% of jobs will be eliminated by automation. Our estimate was about 9%. What they said is 42% of jobs will be affected by technology. So a portion of the job will be assisted. And a good example of that would be doctors, who are going to have much better technology to do diagnoses on. But you're not going to go to Watson on your cell phone and go, Watson, do I have cancer? I do? All right, I better, you're going to go to a doctor who will have technology like this. So the idea that it's going to replace people as opposed to supplement or augment is wrong. A couple other quick points. When you look at the relationship between productivity growth across countries and unemployment, there is essentially none, no relationship. In the US, high productivity is positively correlated to low unemployment, not the other way around. The reason for that, as BLS has shown, high productivity leads to lower prices or higher wages. One of those two, or a combination. People with higher wages or lower prices spend that savings. They spend it on other things. That creates demand. That demand creates jobs. That is kind of, if you will, an iron law of economics. It's not going to change. One of the things economists say, what they criticize people on the other side of this is for engaging in the lump of labor fallacy, that if you have some labor and you eliminate it, it's gone for good. You can never get anything else. As I said before, I think most AI and other related technology are going to boost the quality rather than eliminate jobs. And lastly, I don't think we really have to worry about anything because human needs, particularly in the US where the median household income is about $50,000 or so, I think if you ask most Americans, would you like to live on $200,000 instead of $50,000? Most Americans would say, yeah, sign me up for that right now because I want to buy a new boat. I want to send my kids to college. By the way, I wouldn't mind the local government having a little bit more money so they can have better streets. So our needs are way, way from being satisfied. Innovation is going to help us do that. So what should policymakers do? Let me skip that. Let me just say, first of all, this is not to say that we shouldn't think about these questions, as Congressman Delaney rightly said. We should, and we should be more prepared than we were for the last transition. But we shouldn't panic. This is not going to happen overnight. I would argue the best we're going to get out of this is maybe 3% productivity growth. We have 1% now. 3% is what we had in the 60s when we had low unemployment and high wage growth. So I don't think it's going to be dramatically different. The last thing we should do is try to slow the rate of innovation. When you have people like Larry Summers advocating for a robot tax and Robert Schiller at Yale equating robots to alcohol, a negative externality for both of them, that's something has gone wrong with how our elite economists are thinking about this problem. And last but not least, universal basic income is the worst idea that you could imagine because it would basically ensconce people in unemployment. There's a number of good studies that have shown the longer someone is out of the workforce, the harder it is for them to ever get back in. So we don't want to be creating a system where we're encouraging people not to work. So what should we do? Speed the rate of innovation. That's going to be critical to our standards of living. But reduce the risk of reduce the risk from job loss, not reduce the risk of job loss, reduce the risk from job loss. So I'm not going to weigh in on what Congress should do with the Affordable Care Act. I don't do health care policy, but clearly something is needed to make it so that when people lose their job, they're not losing their health insurance. That scares people as it should scare people. We've got to find some way to make that part of the package of just being a citizen of the U.S. Better unemployment insurance. There are states who have incredibly low unemployment insurance where if you lose your job, and you get unemployment insurance, you lose your job through no fault of your own, you get very, very little. And I think we need a better federal floor around that. We've written about how to restructure higher education to separate credentialing and education so we create a more vibrant market, including things like MOOCs, massively open online courses, and credentialing. And lastly, there's a whole set of things to do, which our other speakers will talk about. Improve worker training, whether that's a training tax credit for companies. U.S. companies spend about 35% less on training than they did 15 years ago. Require states to allow unemployed workers to collect UI while they're in training. There's a federal rule to do that, but it's not really obeyed. So there are many states in this country, when you get laid off and you try to get training to upgrade your skills for those 26 weeks, you are made ineligible from getting unemployment insurance. The best time to train somebody is when they're between jobs like that, and we're not taking advantage of that. And then maybe Lauren can talk a little bit about the role of industry alliances here. So with that, I will stop and turn it over to Adam.
When I'm on. Well, thank you, Rob, for inviting me here today. I want to say first, I really enjoyed this paper that you've done with John, as well as the other papers that ITIF has done on AI issues. This one on it's going to kill us, the myths about AI was really wonderful as well. And like a lot of other ITIF papers, one of the reasons I enjoy reading them and participating in these events is because ITIF sort of plays the role in the field of technology policy that Mythbusters did on television for like popular mythologies or notions that spread throughout culture but yet have no basis in fact. And sort of the myth busting that Rob's done here around sort of the rising techno panic over AI and automation is a really important service that I think they've done, because there is a bit of a panic rising up about AI. I think there's been previous waves of panic, but it's particularly intense right now. And if you think I'm exaggerating, I'll tell you a quick story about a dinner that Rob and I were involved in a couple of months ago. The participant shall remain nameless. It was off-the-record conversation and Chatham House rules, but there was a member of Congress there who I won't name either, and this person went on and on and on with a story about how robots and automation were going to destroy all jobs as we know them, and not just destroy all jobs and have a massive robot workforce, but that massive robot workforce was going to be owned by one and only one person, and that we were going to, I guess, have to effectively impose a UBI tax rate of 99.99% on that one person to redistribute the money to keep the rest of society alive. It was a pretty dismal tale, dripping with dystopian dread, and I kept kind of looking out of the corner of my eye because I thought Rob Atkinson's head was going to explode at any given moment. He was sort of grinding his hands and like, let me get it out again. But he very patiently and diplomatically, point by point, picked apart these arguments. And I tried to join in and try to make the point that I really think Representative Delaney so eloquently made in his opening remarks, which is that, you know, that's not a good scenario for the future if your idea of the future is that bleak, that it entails essentially sort of a stasis or a stagnation of all technological innovation, because that seems to be clear where that particular member of Congress that night at dinner was heading with this, which is that you basically would have to destroy all the machines or your jobs or whatever, the robots, if you wanted to reverse that situation. But we don't need to, because as Rob points out in his paper, that's not what the historical record says. And this is something I've tried to do a little bit of in my own work. And when I was working on my book on permissionless innovation, one thing I did is I said, let's just go back in history and let's look at what others have said or predicted in much the same way Rob talked about in his paper, and how they essentially got it wrong, in some cases wildly wrong. And one of the last great waves of sort of AI concern or techno-panic was in the early 80s. There were a lot of reports done, even reports done by the Reagan administration. And you can go back and look at BLS reports, Bureau of Labor Statistics reports, and others about what they thought the jobs of the future might be, or what kind of sectors would be disrupted, or professions would be wiped out, or skills would be wiped out. And what I did is I took a look at those listings and those professions and those ideas about what the skills of the future were needed, that might be needed, and I just compared them to today's sort of hot jobs boards. And you look out there and you realize when you do this that in 1982, we did not even possess a vocabulary to discuss the professions of the present. That when you look at the hot jobs board, and this one I pulled from, I guess this was Glassdoor's list of the top 25 hot jobs, they included things like software architect, software development manager, solutions architect, analytics manager, IT manager, data scientist, security engineer, UX designer, search engine optimization officer. These things would not have made sense to someone in 1982, or they would have thought they meant something wildly different than they actually do. So there's a real sort of poverty of the imagination when it comes to thinking about the future. And we only think about the sort of dystopian scenarios of robots taking all jobs or automation wiping out all professions. But the reality is something quite different. And the reason it's quite different is, as Rob pointed out, and also Representative Delaney pointed out, it's because human wants and needs are infinite, and they always evolve. We always find new and better things to do with our time and our efforts, our abilities, and we surprise ourselves. And this is the fundamental reason I think I'm optimistic about the future, and it's the primary reason why I think it's so essential that we have some humility about looking at the future and about trying to prognosticate about what's going to happen. My old boss once wrote a book, and he talked about, if you would have asked our parents a quarter century ago, if you would have told them what the world really needs is a really good $5 cup of coffee, they would have laughed in your face. Everybody made cheap Folgers out of a can, right? And then along came like the coffee revolution led by Starbucks and many others. And now we stand in line for these things, right? And $5 would be a good deal on the average day. We're usually spending more than that. But it's not just for coffee, it's for all sorts of innovations. There's so many different kind of crazy professions and services that exist today that would have been laughable to previous generations. I was reading an article the other day about the rise of cuddling services. People pay to cuddle. You know, there's even an app for it. I think it's called Cuddler or Snuggler or something like that. And you get paid to come and like cuddle somebody. And you think, well, that's silly and stupid, but you know what? There's a need for it, the same way there's a need for a lot of like psychological consulting services or maybe business management services or financial planning services that a generation ago would have been thought to be worthless or unnecessary. And yet we have all of those types of services. And so I think when thinking about the future more generally, and I think the key takeaway from Rob's report, and it's the point I try to get across in my book, that the problem with these techno-panics around AI and automation is that if you spend all your time worrying about hypothetical worst-case scenarios, and then you come to base public policy upon hypothetical worst-case scenarios, then almost by definition, best-case scenarios can never come about. That it's only by taking a bit of a leap of faith and engaging in some risk and essentially going into that great unknown we call the future that you actually get progress. Because there is a fundamental and symbiotic relationship historically between technological innovation and human prosperity. Again, that's what Representative Delaney identified early when he talked about we only tend to look through history through one lens. It tends to be the lens of sort of a pessimistic sort of worldview, when in reality, historically, we've done much better than that. And we never give ourselves enough credit for how ingenious humans are in terms of innovating our ways out of problems. as he suggested. It's not easy to predict how we'll do that or when it'll happen, and it'll be messy. It's never going to be clean. It's never going to be enjoyable. But it's a whole heck of a lot better than the alternative, because the alternative, as I see it when I survey the literature in this area, are things like what Rob mentioned. There are people in favor of imposing a robot tax on services like this. I've read papers and proposals for a federal robotics commission or a algorithmic accountability agency. And at some point, these are essentially efforts to impose more of a preemptive precautionary principle mindset on technological innovation that essentially says, thou shalt not until we give you the blessing to move forward. And that's a recipe for economic and social stagnation. It's a model that ultimately will not allow us to raise productivity or improve our lifestyles, our standard of living. And you know, everything I read these days about these issues, this sort of notion is implicit, that's the danger we face. And the funny thing is that all too often the authors don't want to exactly say what I think many of them believe, which is that we really need to sort of throw a wrench into the works and stop progress. And I'll leave you with this one quote, see if you can guess who it is, but I see this a lot in the writing that quotes like this, that technological innovation has destabilized society, made life unfulfilling, subjected human beings to indignities, and inflicted severe damage on the natural world. The continued development of technology will only worsen the situation, and therefore, basically, the single overarching goal must be the elimination of modern technology, and no other goal must be allowed to compete with it. Now, most authors aren't as extreme as the Unabomber, but the point is, don't be the Unabomber. Don't take an approach that suggests that technology is the enemy, because it's not. Technology is just us doing inventive, interesting things with our minds. And we can do those same interesting, inventive things and find solutions to the sort of problems that might be created by this latest concern about automation and AI. Thank you, Rob.
Great. Thank you, Adam. Robert, make sure your mic is on there and pull it close if you would.
Quite rightly, our concern here is about the future. So what is a historian supposed to do, okay? What I tried to do in looking at technology in the past is, in fact, try to provide some kind of long-range perspective. My students are often rather dismayed when they discover that my basic surveying history of technology starts well before 1960. It actually starts right around 1100, okay? But the point I want to make is that, in fact, we do need a longer-term perspective. And I think Rob and his group have done a wonderful job at showing how history can be used in effective ways to put some real facts on the concern that we have. So let me let me do my historian thing now, though, and try to give a longer-term perspective to all this. One of the key things that I've tried to emphasize in looking at the history of technology is to try to get a sense of what are the motivations. Why in fact, has technology changed over time? This is not necessarily as obvious as you might think. And in fact, one of the things that's unique about the experience of the Europeans and the Americans, especially over the last 2 or 3 centuries, is that they, somewhat distinctively from the rest of the world, have in fact adopted a culture, if you will, what I call a culture of improvement, that in fact basically grasp the idea that things can be done better, that we are not satisfied with the way that things are. And this has, over the last 2 or 3 centuries, provided an enormous momentum to technological change. And again, let me emphasize, this is not to be taken for granted. When we look at the sorts of arguments and debates about technology, about the implications of technology, we have to understand that technological change itself is not automatic. It is something that comes out of a set of cultural beliefs, a set of basic axioms, if you will, about how the world works and about how we confront the world that we're living in. This culture of improvement, as I call it, becomes more and more widespread and more significant, starting really about 200 years ago with the first industrial revolution. with that revolution and with the kind of changes that took place, people began to perceive the kinds of changes in lifestyle, the kind of changes in opportunity, the kind of changes in personal satisfaction that Rob has, in fact, given some reference to. And so over time, this culture of improvement had been adopted more and more widely, not just in the West, but now in the rest of the world. And it now becomes particularly powerful because it is informed by science as well as just simply by practical concerns. But the growth of this culture of improvement does not lead to some of the conclusions that some authors have, in fact, tried to put forth. In particular, I want to, and I think, again, Rob's point is something that I'm trying to emphasize here. The idea that technology is inevitably accelerating is, in fact, not a historically supported idea. The fact is that there are waves of historical change in technology. They come, they go. There is nothing inevitable about them. We have periods of enormous change in the past. I sometimes tell my students that if I had fallen asleep sort of Rip Van Winkle style in, say, the year 1840, and had woken up 20 or 25 years later, I would have been completely and utterly disoriented. Far more than, say, if I had fallen asleep in, say, 1980 and woken up in 2005, as amazing as the technologies that we have today may seem to be. And that process of change coming and going, a rapid change followed by consolidation, if you will, sometimes relative stasis, is in fact a historical pattern that we have to respect. And we have absolutely no reason, I would argue, to suggest that that pattern has somehow been permanently broken. I want to emphasize the point I'm making that one of the things that history does is it makes us humble. It makes us realize that predicting the future is, in fact, something that we are very, very bad at. And this is particularly true, as it turns out, for technology and technological change. We are bad at figuring out what the direction of change is going to be, what particular areas are going to be changing the most. We are bad at figuring out what the implications of that change are going to be, who are the winners and who are the losers, which is one of the questions I keep telling my students you always have to ask. And again, at the analysis of the foundation suggests there are winners and there are losers. Over time, however, the winners tend to outnumber the loser by a considerable number. And just how the dynamic of that works is something that we need to pay careful attention to. Another thing that history tells us to make us humble is to point out to us that people have worried about technology and technological change for a very, very long time. I'm not going to quote. Actually, there is a marvelous quotation that I found from a believe it or not, a scribe sometime in the 15th century, worried about what the printing press was going to do to his business. But that kind of response, in fact, has been repeated historically time and time again. And again, for the last 2 centuries or so, people have in fact wondered what kind of policy response that might suggest. In 1843, for example, the U.S. Commissioner of Patents spoke of the imminent arrival of the period when improvement must end, that we've basically gotten all the main things on the table by 1843. Somewhat apocryphally, another commissioner of patents in 1899 were quoted as saying, well, the Patent Office may not have that much to do considering what we've been doing. And in fact, there is a whole literature from the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century suggesting that science and technology needed to slow down, that the big things had been taken care of. This is before Einstein, of course, so science was seen as a kind of mopping up operation. And again, we tend to be very bad at understanding that. Another thing that I can suggest from history are some examples of the kind of responses that have been made when people do panic about technology. And these responses are made at all sorts of levels. Perhaps most famously, about 160 years ago, the Luddites in England began forming gangs that would go around to the textile factories, throwing spanners and hammers into machines to try to prevent the loss of jobs in the textile industry. Sure enough, anybody who read Silas Marner, does anybody read Silas Marner anymore? Okay. Will remember that, in fact, the handloom weavers were pretty miserable for a while. And as I said, there are losers with technologies. But again, that story, too, reminds us that those losers you usually survive, and the overall result for society is, in fact, an enormous amount of progress. Much more recently, I recall myself that in the 1950s and the 1960s, and Adam made some reference to this, the concerns over automation were intense, and all sorts of predictions were being made about, in fact, the disappearance of jobs, the disappearance of entire occupations, and the massive unemployment that would follow. And again, you've seen very good examples of that. And I would emphasize again, from a historian point of view, as marvelous as the internet is, as marvelous as the electronic technology, the artificial intelligence, and all of that, there's absolutely nothing that suggests to me that they are fundamentally different in terms of their threat to the longer-term prosperity. One other point that Rob made that I want to emphasize is historically well-founded, and that is we are very bad at projecting technological futures. Jet aircraft did not, in fact, inevitably lead to SSTs. And it was very interesting when you look at the history of the debate about the supersonic transport in the 1970s, you can see the intersection between technological projection and public policy. And it's actually quite an interesting study to look at it. The United States, in fact, drew back from the pursuit of a supersonic transport, despite the fact that there was an argument that this was the inevitable next step, and that if the United States didn't do it, then in fact somebody else would. But it drew back not because of a terribly clear view of where things were going technologically, but it grew back largely because of economic concerns and some environmental fear. Another area where we've been very bad at understanding change, the transistor and the microcircuits and the digital computers all appeared in the 1950s, and every single one of those elements was very much something that people could not predict. So the fear of technological trajectories has never been useful. This is particularly true, I would argue, in a world that, in Tom Friedman's phrasing, is hot, flat, and crowded. We don't have the option of turning our back on technological change, as any tendency that way will be invitation for others to exploit the possibility for change that will, without question, emerge.
Great, thank you, Robert. So the first two presentations obviously were about why we shouldn't sort of give in to these fears, but that doesn't mean that there aren't, as I think everyone has said, real people who are negatively affected by this, at least in the short to moderate term. And I think one of the reasons there are fears is because people feel like the loss is so catastrophic. And so I think it is very critical that the conversation really be about how do we make it easier for people to make transitions. Lauren, you've been doing a lot of that work. Maybe you could just kick us off with that.
There we go. Thank you so much for having me to the foundation. And a couple decades ago when I was at Maryland, I wish I would have taken the professor's class because that was really interesting. So I just wanted to say a few words about who gets left behind and what approaches are out there and policies are out there that help address these issues when technological changes happen. When we think about globalization, all of these issues, people do get left behind, and how do we address that? Just quickly, who might we be talking about? And this isn't the full range of people that might be affected, but you might think about young adults who are not connected to school or work. They may be kids that were not engaged in high school or failed to receive enough career and educational advice along the way to help guide their choices. And this could be for several reasons: their family circumstances, and schools maybe not adequately helping them along the way. We're also talking about working adults that maybe have no education beyond a high school diploma. They may be in jobs that really don't have the possibility of career advancement, and often have families and must work. So balancing work and family and school could be really difficult. And so being able to gain those more technically oriented skills that meet the current needs of the workforce and of employers could be really challenging for them to move ahead. And then we're also, of course, talking about workers who have been displaced, dislocated from their current jobs, and due to changes in the economy and technological advances. That is certainly happening. And this is especially challenging for individuals who are older and again, don't have an education beyond high school. And they really do, research has shown us that they really do have challenges in finding a new job quickly, and especially one that replaces their wages. And they have this very strong desire to go back to work quickly. They don't want to spend a lot of time in education and training. So what works in thinking about helping young adults and working adults and those who've been dislocated catch up with the changing economy? One thing we have seen in the research and innovations out there are approaches that tie what is learned in high school or other education to the world of work. So this could be dual enrollment programs where high school students earn college credits and credentials that are workforce related, that are industry valued, as they're going through high school, so they can come out of school with a credential that they could get a job with. This could be programs that expose younger students, maybe even in middle school, to careers. We think a lot maybe about STEM and exposing kids in middle school to STEM. There's a great program that's really interesting in Alaska that takes Native Alaskans and brings them to the University of Alaska and teaches them to build computers, and then puts them in college courses and has them work with employers. So there are ways that you can go beyond the career day at school where the parents come in and talk about their jobs to really give that meaningful exposure to particular careers. And then career academies is something maybe you all have heard about, but it really can help students who have maybe dropped out of school or at risk of dropping out of school learn a technical skill in healthcare, in IT. We're seeing a lot of that, and that has been a strategy that's been promising. There are also approaches that accelerate learning in technical fields for adult learners. So again, this idea, especially dislocated workers, they don't want to be spending a lot of time in school. Other working adults are working, they may have families. How do you help them get those skills and those credentials that maybe can help them find that job that advances their career and brings them up to the technological needs of a particular occupation? Career pathway programs are one way, and it's something that's been supported by policy, and I'll talk about that in a second. And it is a sequence of courses that embeds short-term credentials and provides a way that employers can have input and place a value on the credentials being earned. you can all, especially community colleges are really at the forefront of this, and they've been doing a lot of work in recent years around bringing technology into the classroom. The very large $2 billion investment from the Trade Adjustment Assistance, Community College, and Career Training grants provided money to colleges to build capacity for developing programs, providing them the equipment for the latest technological advances. And so bringing that technology to the classroom has been very important for bringing the skills of people into today's workforce. The other thing that's been happening is that there is credit for prior learning and work experience. So especially thinking about folks coming out of the recession, as well as veterans and their experiences and how they could gain credit and experience to help accelerate their learning has been very important. And then finally, I'll mention on-the-job training. There's been a lot of talk about apprenticeship. And really having those on-the-job experiences where you learn and earn, and there are other avenues to do that, such as internships, but apprenticeships have been discussed a lot lately, and it is a path to middle-skill jobs and teaches the skills that are valued by employers because employers are the ones doing the training. However, there is great difficulty in incentivizing employers to provide apprenticeships, and that is a big policy discussion today, really how to make that effectively happen. So I'll just wrap up. I know we're probably short on time, to just say a few words about the policies that are in existence and are being discussed right now, sort of like apprenticeship is. The Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act of 2014, WIOA, is in its early implementation stages. And the new legislation really provides some opportunities for thinking about how to help people catch up to the economy and the workforce. And there's a lot around collaboration between workforce, education, and economic development systems, as well as thinking about the sectoral approaches, the industry approaches to bring employers to the table to ensure training teaches those skills needed in particular occupations, especially those in demand. And there are misperceptions around that job training doesn't work, but I think there's a lot out there, and I can point you all to particular studies that show, especially around sectoral approaches, can be very effective, especially for bringing those who may be lower skill into more middle skill jobs. There are also Pell Grants, and one of the changes recently has been to bring back the ability to benefit provision, and this helps especially individuals who are without a high school credential to access college courses as long as it's on a career pathway. And I think that's a really key way to encourage supporting workers in this current workforce. Also, the House just voted to pass the Perkins reauthorization, which is an important source of funding for career and technical training for youth and adults. It now needs to go to the Senate, and I know the House passed a similar bill last year, and that did not advance. And then, frankly, not everyone really may be able to take advantage of these kinds of programs. That just may not be what is feasible. So how do we make jobs good jobs? And there's a lot of discussion around paid leave and other ways to improve job quality. So I think that's just a short summary of the policy discussions that are going on and the key policies that are out there. But happy to discuss that more afterwards as well.
Great. Thank you, Lauren. Ted.
Great. Thanks very much. Thanks, Rob. It's good to be here with you. And Rob's work is always provocative and interesting, and I found this paper very much the same. I want to talk a little bit about the policy response. I think Rob, as well as Adam and Robert, very much talked about the danger of overreaction, thinking that change is coming far faster than before, and going down policy roads like a robot tax or UBI that are really counterproductive. I do think that there is actually an equal danger of underreaction. So Congressman Delaney said, and I think this was absolutely accurate looking at the research I've done, is that in advance of these developments, it's actually fairly obvious who the losers will be. Now, they may well be enormously outnumbered by the winners. That's, no reason to turn your back on either globalization or technology, but we do actually have a pretty good idea who the losers are going to be. And he mentioned President Kennedy, who was concerned both about the impacts of technology and the impacts of trade. And Kennedy's history in this is really interesting. He, as a senator in the 1950s, seized on the idea of trade adjustment assistance for American communities and workers who lost their jobs as a result of import competition. And he ended up championing the program as president and got it passed through the Congress in 1962 and gave a whole series of very profound speeches on it in which he basically said, look, open trade is very much in the interest of the United States. It's good for our economy, it's good for our companies, it's good for our workers on the whole, it's important for American diplomacy and alliance building, but there are going to be people and places in this country who are going to be harmed. And it's not reasonable to pursue a policy that's in the general national interest and then let a small subset of the American population absorb all the cost. And so the Congress created this program, Trade Adjustment Assistance, which was supposed to funnel generous support to dislocated workers and to communities harmed by import competition. Well, the reality of the program was it never really got off the ground. If you look at the first 6 years after the creation of Trade Adjustment Assistance, there was not a single dime paid out to any American worker or any U.S. community. There were 25 petitions that were filed by different groups of workers, but the criteria had been written so narrowly by the Congress and interpreted so narrowly by the regulators that you had to be able to show that you had lost your job as a result of a particular tariff cut that the U.S. had made in a particular trade agreement. You had to be able to trace it that directly in order to be eligible for the assistance. What Kennedy feared was that in the absence of measures that would help Americans adjust to the rapid change created by technology or trade, that the result would be that we would turn inward. We would try to slow down technological development and we would try to retard trade liberalization. And I think we're seeing considerable elements of that today. If you look at where the United States stacks up compared to other countries on initiatives to help the workforce adjust, we are way, way behind. The Germans do this far better than we do. The Japanese do this far better than we do. Any country in Europe pretty much does it better than we do. The Canadians do it better than we do. If you look just at spending, and I'll accept that spending is not a perfect metric, but if you look at the OECD numbers, the United States spends 0.1% of its GDP on what are called active labor market programs, which are the kind of retraining programs that Lauren is talking about here. The average in the OECD is 0.5% of GDP, so 5 times as much as the United States spends. In Denmark, it's 2% of GDP. They also have a very flexible labor market like we do here in the United States, but they spend a lot of money getting people back in the labor market when they lose their jobs for whatever reason. And at the end of the day, this does have very significant consequences. I mean, we know for all the positive benefits that have come from innovation, there are lots of parts of this country that are not doing very well. You know, median earnings have not grown rapidly for decades. Economic and social mobility has declined. There was a great speech a couple of days ago by Ben Bernanke pointing all this out, a speech titled, "When Growth is Not Enough." And we can debate all the causes of that, but there are real hardships occurring in this country, and we've seen the political impact of it. So again, I think we can and should debate how rapid the change is going to be, and I agree with Rob. I think in a lot of ways change is going to be slower, but it will still be a challenge. The reality is most of us don't like change. Do you want me to, I can finish in 2 minutes here, Rob, or do you want me to finish off on them?
3 minutes.
The reality is
I'm
people do not, well, he warned me that I might be interrupted, so I was prepared for it. The reality is people don't embrace change easily. It's hard. I was told a story the other day by one of President Bill Clinton's former aides who said that Clinton had told him that one of the dumbest things Clinton had ever said as president was to go out and give campaign speeches where he would tell people, look, you're going to have to reinvent yourself 5 or 6 or 7 times during the course of your career. It's not going to be like your dad's job where you did the same thing for years and years. He said, look, people don't want to hear that. That's a very unsettling prospect, even if it may be true. And I would hypothesize, I do not have the evidence for this, and maybe Rob will delve into this in more detail, that even though the scale of job disruption may be smaller now, the transition is harder. if you're thinking about the move from farming to early stage manufacturing, what did you need? You know, you needed strength and the ability to tinker. You could move pretty easily from a farm job to an industrial job. Today, if you lose your industrial job and you have to move into the IT world or, you know, personal service delivery or other things, it's a very, very different set of skills, much harder to acquire. So what to do? There are a lot of ideas out there. I put a paper out that I just finished recently with Bob Lighton, who's an economist who works on a lot of these issues. You know, we talk about the expanded use of wage insurance for people who want to get back into the labor market quickly. We argue for the creation of lifetime career training accounts that people could draw on at any point in their careers and would be paid on an income contingent basis. So if you do very well in your subsequent employment, you'll pay it all back. If you don't do so well, they'll in fact be a subsidy from the government. There are a lot of good ideas out there. Lauren laid out a bunch of them here. I think that what is really needed is the development of a political consensus, and I think it's based on the truth, which is that the very real gains from innovation, from technology, from trade are going to be threatened if we don't come up with systems that help Americans make the adjustment better than we have been doing so far. I would argue we failed quite badly in the era of globalization. And we know there's more coming in the era of technology, and we've got to do a lot more serious thinking and really come together as a country to say, we are going to help our citizens make this transition successfully so that we're all more prosperous. I'm going to stop there, Robin.
All right. Thank you, Ted. So we're really pleased and honored that Representative Randy Holtgren has joined us. Congressman Holtgren serves in Illinois' 14th Congressional District, just sort of south of Chicago, near the federal lab, south and west. Yeah, just western suburbs. With at least part of the federal lab, at least some of the people who work for it. So very interested in science and technology policy. Congressman Holtgren was elected to the DuPage County Board in 1994, to the Illinois House of Representatives in 1999, and the Illinois Senate in 2007. Here in Congress, he serves on the Committee on Financial Services. He's the Vice Chairman of the Subcommittee on Capital Markets, Securities, and Investment. He's also on the Subcommittee on Housing and Insurance. And he's on the Committee on Space, Science, and Technology, where he's on the Subcommittee for Research and Technology and Energy. So with that, Congressman. Thank you.
Thank you. Good to be with you. I'll be quick. Thank you. Sorry to
No problem.
speed up, Ted, but I absolutely agree with you. And great to have you all here. I love seeing these type of events full. So congratulations, because I think this is so important. And I think there's a lot of misinformation out there. A couple challenges. First, as I'm back in my district is the 7 counties that wrap around Chicago. So it's a lot of commuters, and then as you get further out, it's pretty rural, a lot of farmland out that way. But number one issue that I have heard and continue to hear is concern about our economy and jobs, that people just want to know that the future is bright, that there are going to be opportunities for them and their families, the people they care about, going into the future. And then with that, the challenge that I get excited about is innovation. Serving on the Science Committee, serving as co-chairman of the FinTech Caucus, seeing new opportunities in our markets, in investments, in banking, where every single day it becomes easier and easier for me to be able to get total access to my accounts, to be able to deposit checks, to be able to move money around, to be able to do whatever I need to do from my phone is incredible. But the challenge that comes with that as well of making sure that it's safe, that it's secure, that I have confidence with it, that my information is safe in there. But as these new technology developments grow every single day, I do represent Fermilab, a wonderful national laboratory, and Argonne is just a little bit outside my district. So I love hearing new technology, new development, everything that is coming out of that. But especially as you focus on technology, I think there has been this misperception that with advancement, especially in technology, that it's taking away jobs. And I think that is a really warped view of this growth in technology. Sure, you know, some jobs change, but I think with new technology, and I think this is what ITIF's report really makes so clear to me, is that new opportunities open up. And we as government have to be on the ball on this. We got to be sharp and recognize exactly as you were saying, Ted, coming together and preparing. How do we prepare young people? How do we spark that interest early and often that there are great opportunities in technology and new advancement for them? And for those who see their career maybe changing or going away, how are we equipped in the best way to help them move quickly? I just was with a group that is a brand new startup, a finance startup just right across the road from O'Hare Airport. So a little bit outside of Chicago, but they're talking about how challenging it is for them to get people to work for them. Great opportunity, incredible, I mean, groundbreaking stuff that they're doing, but just getting qualified workforce. And they were talking about some of the great coding boot camps that have started up in the city of Chicago, taking people who have never done this stuff before in a relatively short period of time, getting them up to speed so that they can have a real impact and potentially be part of something that could truly be groundbreaking, earth-shattering opportunities for people. So we have to continue to encourage people. I think a lot of this stuff from my generation, I can be fearful and say, well, I could never figure that out. But I think many of us can, and that's where we do have to be looking to young people, to making sure that we've got community colleges working with industry, looking at apprenticeship type things where we can make sure that people can make these transitions into new opportunities. So rather than fearing development, embracing it and seeing that there's so many new opportunities. One last thing I'll say is tied back to financial services and how it has opened up opportunities for people who haven't had access to banking, who now really can, and who haven't had access to investments or the marketplace and have felt fearful about that. But seeing for really relatively low dollar amount and pretty easy access for people to start getting a part of realizing that they can be in the markets as well if they choose to. So I see it that the opportunities are so bright, so compelling, real challenges. We do need to come together. We need to figure out what is the role of government in encouraging young people and people who are going to have to retool. But through all of this, I think our future is very bright, and I'm optimistic. So thank you for being here. Thank you for a great panel that's here. I look forward to hearing how we can be helpful. And I think, again, this is something you see John Delaney and I as part of this conversation today. It brings us together. There's not enough things that bring us together, Republicans, Democrats, House, Senate. This is one of those things of realizing that fintech and really all technology has a great opportunity to, if we can lock arms, if we can bring the right people together and have right policy, making sure that we're training those and sparking that interest early. Again, I think it's going to be good for our economy, but also good for our future. So thank you all so much for being here. Thanks, Rob. Thanks for having me. Thanks.
So we've got, we're going to stop precisely at 1:30, so that gives us 13 minutes. If you have questions, just raise your hand and say who you are, and then, yes, sir, right back there.
Of prime-age men, 25 to 54, who don't have any job at all, and the steady increase in that category dating from the 1960s, I believe his argument is that that is kind of what a job market would look like if it was being disrupted by automation and technological change. That you would have, particularly when you look at the education levels, high school educated men have seen a sharp drop in the number of them who have any job at all. So now there are many explanations for that, but do you guys see any role in technological change in that decline? And then my second question is, in your study by the ITIF, you looked at the changes in occupations. How does change within occupation, where maybe the same job requires very different skills? So even though the same occupation is still there, the same job is there, it might be a very different one. Did your research look at that type of thing?
Yeah. So on the second question, no, we didn't, just because the data sets don't exist for that. And it's possible you could have churn within an occupation. You have 100,000 accountants at the end of a decade in the beginning, but they're different accountants because the skill sets have changed. So don't know, haven't been able to look at that. On the prime age men one, First of all, it's hard to make an argument that, there's two arguments I think that are important here. One is an argument about overall unemployment rates, which Summers is not making, more or less, but most of the advocates on the other side of this argument are making, which is that this will lead to structurally higher unemployment. This is Klaus Schwab's point at the World Economic Forum. These folks are saying we're talking 20, 30, 40% unemployment rates. That's, to me, there's just no evidence of that. There's no logic, there's no evidence. The Summers point is that certain individuals are hurt. Absolutely, certain individuals and types of individuals are hurt as labor markets evolve. But I think he overstates the case on prime age, non-college educated men when it comes to this, in the sense of, there's a big debate, which I won't go into the details of, how much of that was due to automation and how much of that was due to trade. We would argue it was more of it was due to trade, and it's a sort of gets into a very technical question of how the BEA measures manufacturing output. They actually overstate manufacturing output growth, particularly in the computer sector, which means that they overstate the rate of productivity growth, which means they overstate the rate of automation. So I don't think that's, I think Summers is maybe right that some of that's caused by structural changes in the market, but it's not almost, not most of that's technology. And secondly, to Ted's point, we've done a bad job. It wasn't like we didn't know some of this was going to happen. We just chose not to do very much about it or not to do enough about it. And so I think the lesson there is not that we should have somehow stopped globalization or told Ford Motor Company, don't put in that new machine tool. It was, let's proactively get ahead of this by 5 years. A good example is trucking. We know that there are going to be fewer truckers at some point in history, some point in the future. Probably not going to happen for 10 years, but there will be fewer truckers. We know that. So why don't we start thinking about how we would respond to that? So, I don't know, Ted, you want to?
I mean, can I just add in, Chris, if you look at European labor force participation rates, they didn't fall in the same dramatic way that they fell in the United States, even though you have similar kind of technological and trade pressures. And I really do think that speaks to the failure of the United States to help workers make adjustments into other parts of the labor market. I mean, the fact is we're at a record right now. It's 6 million job openings in the JOLTS data. So it's not that there's an absolute lack of jobs. It's just we've got this huge mismatch. And I think a lot of people lost occupations and have not been reskilled for other occupations. And for a variety of reasons have dropped out of the labor market. I mean, we can talk about incentives to do that in terms of Social Security, disability, and other things. But I do think this is a policy failure rather than some effective technology that we're seeing play out in the market.
And I think there's also very clear evidence that the changes in SDI coverage was a big contributor to this. It was a lot easier to get disability coverage, and a lot of people took advantage of it. You can argue that you can like it or you don't like it, but I think causally it's been shown. Yes, ma'am. Lauren, do you want to jump on that?
I'll just say a few words. I mean, I think in the education system, there's been a lack of connection to employers and their needs very historically, but there is a huge push from federal policy, state policy to make those connections more explicit, more active, and there is funding behind it. So I think that is one of the things that has just been a failure of the system to do more effectively.
And I think to Ted's point, it's a combination of lack of money. I mean, money matters, and a lack of rigorous pushing of innovation. I'll give you a quick example of that. Back in 2000, we were, my old think tank, we were big advocates of this thing called regional skills alliances. The idea would be the federal government would fund, through the Workforce Investment Act, industry-led or industry union-led, where it was appropriate, skills alliances that industry take the lead on. That was a great program. Everybody loved it, except the Workforce Investment Act bodies and boards. They didn't like that program. They hated that program, and they lobbied against it. And the reason they lobbied against it was because they didn't, it would have taken sort of the lead a little bit away from them. And so there are innovative ideas. Lauren, you listed a whole lot of innovative ideas, and I think we have to remember that we're not talking about just the kind of innovation, Adam, you're talking about, but we're talking about policy innovation. And there are winners and losers in policy innovation, and the losers don't like to lose, and so they will come up here and tell you why their approach is the best approach and why this newfangled approach is the wrong approach. So I think it's important to at least have that as an open dialogue. Yes, sir. I'm going to go here and then here and here. So right here. Adam, you want to take that?
Well,
I'm sorry, yeah.
automated vehicles, automation for transportation and cars. You're probably well aware, tomorrow there's going to be an entire workshop, joint workshop for the Federal Trade Commission and NHTSA are doing a joint workshop on connected car technologies focused on privacy and security issues. But this has been a hot topic of conversation among many different government agencies and committees in Congress. There's been some interesting progress, and there's now, I think, something like 14 bills pending right now that have been floated in Congress to deal with various aspects of this debate. So there's a lot of cooks in the kitchen when it comes to interest in automated vehicles or connected cars. Personally, I'm very optimistic about the kind of life-enriching and even life-saving changes that could come about out of this particular sector if we get policies right. Some have gone so far as to say this could be the biggest public health success story of our lifetimes. We're talking about every day on the roads, 95 people dying and 6,500 people injured due to human error behind the wheel, which is 94% of all accidents are attributable to human error, according to NHTSA. So if ever automation and algorithmic systems and robotic systems could do a world of good, it's in the things we call cars that are now really just rolling computers on wheels down the road.
So let me try to get in. There are two more folks, and I want to just have them ask both your questions because I want to respect people's time. Was it? I think it was here and then here. So if you can both ask your questions, then we'll answer them together.
Both congressmen and leadership in agencies have admitted that government is not very good at keeping pace with the rate of innovation. Are you guys seeing any indications that government will be able to enact policy or change the way it treats innovation and the way it treats workers left behind at the same pace that innovation causes those changes?
Okay, thank you. Yes, sir, right here.
Gustavo Novaes from United Nations University. I'm interested in your statement, categorical against basic income, and I'm coming mostly from one article I read from Barry Karsler from the World Bank, a senior economist there. They kind of gather the data on cash transfers and impact and social protection. And it shows the very positive impact on one side for innovation, on development of human capital that can be used, and another, no evidence of, no evidence of having
Unemployment?
No, unemployment, yeah, it took a longer time, but better placement, but laziness of not willing to go after employment.
Okay, sure.
So I wondered how.
Great. All right, so the first question, anybody wants to?
I have a small comment that one of the interesting new ways that government bodies are trying to keep pace with the speed of technological change is an evolution of so-called soft law techniques in preference to hard law techniques. And soft law can be things like multi-stakeholder processes, codes of conduct, best practices, agency guidance. I'm currently writing a very lengthy paper with Ryan Hageman of the Niskanen Center where we document for all of the various emerging technologies, not just robotics and AI, but many, many others, you're starting to witness a shift into soft law governance mechanisms as a method of dealing in a more political entrepreneurial way with technological change. The problem with the system is that it's messy and it can lack accountability, and there's concerns about transparency and enforcement. The upside is you can roll with the punches that technology throws at you. And this is all the rage at the FDA, at the FTC, at NTIA, at FCC, many, many other agencies are starting to shift their attention to those sort of mechanisms. The only difference for AI and robotics is there's not a single agency that currently deals with a lot of the issues we're discussing here. It's sort of spread over many agencies, so that creates some unique challenges.
Lauren?
I can just say a little bit. One example of government keeping pace with technological advances and innovation in terms of the workforce and the needs of employers is the state of Kansas has designed its career and technical system with community colleges to only fund programs that are in high demand, that are for jobs that are in high demand and require those technical skills. So it's a way that they've designed their system to be really responsive to the needs of employers, and employers are engaged in developing those programs and the skills and the credentials that come out of them. Another policy change Kansas actually made was that TANF participants can actually use some of their dollars to participate in these programs that are career pathway, and especially those with low basic skills. And so they've used some of that money for training of TANF individuals and connected those systems.
So before we close, let me just quickly say, I think there's a big difference between sort of minimal amounts of UBI that are a little topping off income, kind of like Milton Friedman negative income tax, and what the real UBI advocates in Silicon Valley and other places want. The Switzerland vote on UBI, which was, enough money to really live on, like $20,000, $30,000 a year, where if you wanted to not work, you could. The evidence, I think, is quite clear. When you do that, you pay people not to work, and they don't work. You take out consumer demand from the economy, and you're giving it to somebody. So you want to know why Europe doesn't have as many jobs? It's because they pay people not to work. You are taking consumer demand away from what would go to workers, and you're giving it to people who don't work. The other component of that is, look, if we're ever close to needing that, which I would bet anybody, in fact, I do have a bet, an open bet with Christian Science Monitor. I bet $1,000 that the unemployment rate and the workforce participation rate in 2027 or 2026 will be lower than a certain amount. No one's ever taken me up on that bet. Happy to bet anybody. If we ever get there, we got plenty of time to start playing with this idea, but we're so far away from it, not even worth, my view, thinking about. Before we close, I do want to thank my co-author, John Wu, who did really the yeoman's work on the actual analysis and data crunching and all of that with this paper. So thank you, John. So please join me in thanking 4 great panelists.